Good evening. You know, the best job I had was Kabul University, so I really envy Mr. Shigeo Katsu. The job you have is the job I'd like to have. But as it is, I have to speak from the perspective of the job that I have, so you'll indulge me. I'll speak for about 25 minutes. Asia was a concept, but not an economy, and not a sociological reality of interactions. In the next 25 years, probably one of the most profound changes in human history is going to occur, which is the emergence of an Asian continental economy. We have only two precedents. One, the emergence of the United States in 1869 as a continental economy. In 1869, the Pacific and Atlantic railways joined and hitherto transformed what was a geographical space into a political economic space. And second, of course, is the emergence of the European Union, but much more slow, much more gradual. This is the greatest opportunity that we have. And here, in part, the past is the vision of the future. From President Xi Jinping to all of us, we are speaking back about the Silk Road. But what was the Silk Road? First of all, it was many roads. But second, it was a system. It was one of the most organized trading systems that the earth knew. The bills of exchange were invented at least 2,000 years ago as part of the Silk Road. The word check derives its origin from Persian. Bills of exchange united Nepal all the way to Nizhny Novgorod and across the Middle East. Three, it was an organized system of transport. Four, the nature of the commodities linked an incredibly complex trading system. Fourth, there was a knowledge system of interactivity, acceptance, interaction. It's in this context that the word roundabout acquires meaning. What's a roundabout and what is its opposite? A roundabout, Toynbee observed, is a place where ideas, peoples, and goods flow. The contrast is with a cul-de-sac. Cul-de-sac is a place where people, ideas, and goods get to be stuck. So he coined the term, incidentally, for Afghanistan. Because for 2,400 years, Afghanistan was a roundabout. But in the 19th century, it became a cul-de-sac. It became the end of the earth because two imperial systems turned it into a periphery. So the lesson here is roundabouts can change to cul-de-sacs can change into roundabouts. One of the greatest events, of course, that has happened, and Kazakhstan is at the forefront of it, is the solution of the former Soviet Union. As long as the Soviet Union existed, a lot of places, including Kazakhstan and Afghanistan, were turned into cul-de-sacs. The dissolution of the former Soviet Union opened up a new set of flows, a new set of activities, a new set of transformations. Here, the emergence of the roundabout is not product of deliberate continental transformation, but a series of events or joining to produce these roundabouts. As we speak every day, the change in infrastructure is making Asia more connected. 4 years ago, for the first time, inter-Asian trade exceeded Asia's trade with Europe and America. And that is a true harbinger of things to come. I'll come back to this notion of how roundabouts are produced and how the cul-de-sacs are. So that's the opportunity. But what's the threat? First, the first threat is our mental outlooks. Look at the infrastructure, the Global Logistics Index that the World Bank produces. Incidentally, it's so good to see so many former colleagues. There is a stamp that one cannot shake, no matter how critical of it one is. So I'm grateful for the education that I acquired, though my education was against the grain. The grain of the habits that the World Bank had and had to be questioned, because that, again, is part of what the outlooks bring. If you look at the World Logistics Index, particularly in terms of Asia, it's not infrastructure that is the fundamental constraint. It's policies. We, all of us, have erected systems that slow things down, that prevent interactivity from taking place, barriers that need not be there or there. So mental outlooks really matter. They're a fundamental constraint. Second is the nature of investments. We think nationally. And when we think nationally, which I hope is rationally too, it needs the regional angle. If you look at the way infrastructure is laid down, if smallest adjustment were made from a regional perspective, things would change radically and could have a lot of implications. But to that production of infrastructure, I'll come back. But the larger threat, now that we are dealing with, and our immense sympathies to everybody in Paris today, in Bamako, before that in Istanbul, Beirut, but we in Afghanistan experience the largest threat, which is the new form of terrorism. So let me elaborate on this with some concepts and then turn back to the opportunities. First of all, while terrorism is an abomination morally, we need to recognize that it's a system sociological. My submission is that we need to approach terrorism as an ecological system. It is becoming inhabited in ways that all ecosystems are inhabited. And unless its systematic nature is recognized, we will not be able to devise ways to overcome it. What are some of this element? First, global criminality makes this possible. The global criminal economy, what Moses Naim called illicit, is $1.7 trillion a year. And that network is an enabler network simultaneously of this violence that is inflicted upon us. Second, it's a network. Those of us who come from traditions of states or companies understand hierarchies well, but we have a great failure understanding networks. Networks are organized on the basis of different principles than hierarchies. Networks are incredibly fast, while hierarchies are slow. So in terms of response, we are taking state organizations, particularly weak state organizations, to respond to incredibly fast changing networks. 3, the nature of transfer of experience within these networks is extraordinarily rapid. If Al-Qaeda, with all apologies to Microsoft, was Windows 2, Daesh is Windows 5, in the process of transforming itself to 6. And what is striking is how fast this ecology is changing and how vicious the networks are becoming. None of these networks are national-based. By definition, they do not have passports. So they do not respect boundaries. But our responses are constrained by boundaries and myriads of rules and regulations. The other point about these networks is that they are simultaneously cooperative and competitive. Daesh, for instance, competes with Al-Qaeda while simultaneously cooperating with it. Now, if the ecology has these characteristics, the next thing is to understand its pathology. Terrorism is become pathological and is becoming more pronouncedly pathological. Paris, again, is the latest indicator, as is Bamako today. Entering into a theater, shooting for the sake of shooting. What is the purpose of this? Theater. We're dealing with a theater of violence. The purpose is to inflict the largest damage into harm the basic sense of belief in trust. What is under attack? The fabric of citizenship that so laboriously and so systematically been constructed over the last 100 years. Can you imagine anybody 3 weeks ago in Paris looking over their shoulders? But today, every Parisian is to look over her shoulder. What is the other thing under attack? The fundamental contract between the state and the citizen. The state, the modern state, is based on a contract that the individual is protected by state institutions. And this is what is under attack. Third thing, if you have noticed about the recent pathology, freedom of movement is under attack. Sharm el-Sheikh, Istanbul, Paris are the greatest centers of tourism. Blowing the Russian airliner, attacking Istanbul, then attacking Paris. Our freedom of movement, that again was acquired through such effort. Because prior to the advent of the modern nation state, it's a 19th century version, freedom of movement was fine. Particularly in this part of the world, we had long distance trade for millennia. After the advent of it's the nation state that invented the passport. But recent freedom of movement that has been acquired is now under severe attack. Last point, so that we can have point for discussion, is morphology. Organizationally, it is modifying. We are not dealing with stable structures. All our systems of learning, all our habits of thought have habituated us to value stability, not only to value stability, but to think in stable categories. From a social science perspective, from a position of learning perspective, we have a great deal of difficulty thinking through changing, constant change. There's a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and that applies to us with a vengeance. But we're dealing with changing morphologies. So with this kind of threat, we need to think back both the state in terms of the national space system of interrelationship between states regionally and the global sets of relationship. So what's the first point? The first point, of course, is that there are no two worlds. There's only one world. But our reaction at first, of course, is to construct fortresses around ourselves. Fortress Europe, Fortress North America, Fortress Northeast Asia, etc. That type of closing in upon oneself actually allows the threat to increase, not to decrease. And this must be realized as the profound challenge of our lives in 2015. Because the next decade is going to be the decade of a challenge. This threat, if I'm right about the ecology, morphology, and pathology, we're not dealing with a short-term problem. We're dealing with a medium-term problem. Second is, this morphology and ecology and pathology cannot thrive without tolerance of some states and some non-state actors providing the enabling environment, tolerance, or supporting them. What do we suffer in Afghanistan from? Because we are at the forefront of this, that's why we can see things that are hoped or not visited upon others, but have lessons for them. That is that when sanctuary is provided, when good and bad terrorists are differentiated, when one thinks one's neighbor's problem or one's opportunity, we play a zero-sum game and reinforce these threats. Our fundamental problem in Asia, particularly South Asia, is that there are no rules governing relations between states. What is in international law is not what is in practice. And if you look into the Middle East, again, the lack of rules of the game has enabled these ungoverned spaces to emerge. And thirdly, of course, at the global level, we are incredibly slow. If the UN didn't exist, despite all our criticisms of it, well, we may have to reinvent it. But this slow response vis-a-vis fast-changing system is the fundamental challenge of the next 10 years. Do we acquire the speed, the capacity for concerted action, the creativity to delineate rules of the game, and to be able to move together? But the most fundamental thing, again, comes to mental models. Do we close in on ourselves and put our hands like in the sand in denial that we have a collective problem and that it's the problem of others, or do we come together? Back to opportunity. Asia's emerging continental economy is the greatest possibility for truly achieving not only the Millennium Development Goal, but the new goals. And that is to end poverty within a generation. If we are going to move towards this opportunity, then we need to look both at infrastructure, state building and market building, and nation building in new ways. First, infrastructure. We've approached infrastructure as a project at a time. Incredibly laborious, incredibly time-consuming, incredibly expensive. We need to change our conception of building infrastructure as clusters of infrastructure, related set of things. Because what produces a roundabout is that investment in turning a geographical space into a place. So what is an illustration of this? The best way of connecting Central Asia and South Asia is Afghanistan. Turn it inside, outside, that's the way. It is what geography is provided, but what history is denied for 200 years. Now, if we waited for a project at the time, we'll have to wait another 200 years probably. But the cluster approach that I'm advocating, and my colleagues and I are in the process of implementing, is first to see ourselves as a central hub for the energy trade. We're in the process of realizing the first transmission lines from Kyrgyzstan to Tajikistan to Afghanistan to Pakistan, and simultaneously from Turkmenistan to Uzbekistan to Afghanistan to Pakistan. Power generation, power sharing, and sense of electricity. There are other forms of power to share, particularly empowerment of women, to come to. But this will be a transformative process. Now, if every dam was done individually, it'd take years. But if we take every river as a system and everything together, there is an enormous opportunity to bring light to the dark cities of South Asia. Second are pipelines. The way pipelines are laid down in the next 10 years are going to have 100 to 200-year impacts. Those choices on routes, on relationships, etc., really are going to affect things. Third are railways. Fourth are airports. Fifth is fiber optics. And sixth is canals and dams, just to give you 6 in quick succession. But these all deal with changing opportunities. In a country where 36% of the people are under the poverty line, the official poverty line, and if you change the poverty line to $2 a day, 70% of the population will be under the poverty line. Look at the potential transformative impact of this. The second issue is, how do we approach state building? Not as just a process of top-down, but a simultaneous process of top-down and bottom-up. What becomes critical to the process of state building is a process of building citizenship. If people are not bound by rights and obligations, they are not going to care about state structures. If we are not going to give to fear, then people must become stakeholders in systems. Because without people becoming stakeholders in systems, we will not be able to overcome the ecology of fear or its pathology. We in Afghanistan have had a young girl's throat slit, as well as old men and women. Why? In order to inflict fear, to put fear in our hearts, in order to deny us opportunities for change. You know, when there was the moment of the absurd, you had the theater of the absurd, but now you have the spectacle of fear. And the best way to overcome fear is to build the equality of citizens. But third thing is regional cooperation. What cannot be achieved, if you go the old route of thinking a nation at a time, it will take decades. But regional cooperation can fundamentally change the nature of opportunities and diminish the nature of the threats. Because it's in that context that we embrace a vision of hope, a vision of opportunity, but also a vision of solidarity. These are not threats that we can face alone. These are threats where we must join hands and be able to create the type of solidarity that says it's a solid wall of humanity. Because each time, this is not the first time in recent history or in longer history that humanity has seen threats. But why has there been success in the past? When there has been solidarity and determination and will to overcome an obstacle. And that's the kind of marshalling of opportunity that must be there. And if this point of regional cooperation is to be done, then creating roundabouts is absolutely essential to this. That we have the movement, the opportunity. And creation of roundabout is a way of saying no to binary choices. Turkey is a classic example. Turkey is now roundabout. East-west, north-south, etc. But for 40 years, it was stuck in choices. Is it Muslim or is it Western? Is it European or is it Asian? Etc., etc. It simply changed the R to end, and it took off. It's not free of problems, but it's a fundamental set of transformation. But when we choose to become cul-de-sacs, then we only have ourselves to blame. And lastly, global work, and particularly here, the dialogue of civilizations. History matters because part of this ecology of fear is the politics of identity. And we must be able to put a counter-narrative. A narrative of civilizations working together, reinforcing each other, having the space of tolerance and interactivity. Joseph Needham, the great scientist who wrote one of the most massive works on China, Science and Civilization in China, was part of this immense effort to create a dialogue between civilizations. And it came from a very interesting interaction. He was a professor at Cambridge, and he had some Chinese students. And Professor Needham made some observations, and the Chinese told him that he was off his rockers because this did not apply to Chinese history. He learned Chinese at middle age and spent the rest of his life documenting this. The history of Islam, Islamic science, is just recently being unraveled. And I'll conclude with one man. His name was Abu Rayhan Biruni. He lived 1,000 years ago in the city of Ghazni, which was then our capital. He measured the circumference of the earth within decimal points. He determined the location of every city precisely. In his mathematical work, provided the ground for years. Ghazni is now under attack. It feels itself to be a cul-de-sac, but it hopes to, like rest of Afghanistan, be a roundabout. We live in a moment of great danger and great opportunity. With determination, with will, with understanding, and with cooperation. the danger can be turned probably into one of the greatest opportunities in history to create not half a world, as Dean Acheson said in his memoirs, Presented Creation, but a full world that would be inhabitable. Thank you.